Climate change policy is dividing the nation, and it should be bringing the nation together. Unfortunately, neither the Greens, the Labor Party or the Coalition have a policy in place that will defend Australia from climate change. I've been studying the science and the politics of climate change since about 2000. And in that year, I've got to say I was a true climate believer and caring about what sort of world I was going to leave to my kids. By 2007, I'd become a complete skeptic. And now I'd say I have a foot in both camps. I'm not sure. But what I'm sure of is that climate change is a threat that we can't just ignore. It means more droughts, hotter days, more severe and regular bushfires, all the things that our governments have been telling us. The fact is though, we have no defence against it because Australia is placing a huge bet that all the other nations on the planet are going to do something about their emissions to save us from these threats. And the fact is that when you study what the other nations are doing, they're not doing it because of climate change at all. They're doing it because of strategic energy requirements and sustainability requirements. As the climate minister from Europe, the European climate minister, recently said in Australia, it doesn't matter whether you're a skeptic or a believer. Everybody understands we have a sustainability problem. The answer is Europe has a sustainability problem and a strategic energy problem. We don't. Neither does the US. China has the world's third largest coal reserves. It only imports about 3% of the coal, even though we supply massive exports to them. But we get told we emit CO2 on a per capita basis at 5 times the rate of the Chinese. And we get told that they're spending more on renewable energy than we are. But if you want to take a per capita basis, the fact is that Australia has 2.5 times the wind turbines in place per capita than China has today. That's just a straightforward fact. And all of ours are connected to the grid. And China doesn't even have a national grid yet. China understands it has a huge problem. Even though it's resource rich, especially when it comes to coal, it has 1.3 billion people heading to 1.4 billion people. And they're going to double their output by the year 2020 of emissions. It's not much per capita, but when you multiply it by 1.3 billion people, it's about 9 billion tonnes of CO2 emissions. Australia is insignificant until countries like China, India, Russia even, and the USA actually start reducing their emissions. Climate change on a planetary scale is unavoidable, and carbon taxes and emission trading schemes in Australia are a total waste of time. It won't stop the ocean rising. It won't stop the droughts, the cyclones or the floods. So what should we do? We need to defend ourselves against the threat of climate change. It's too serious. It may not happen, but we have to accept it's a possibility. So we have to look at defending ourselves against the consequences. So what can we do? Well, the first step would be to drought-proof the nation. Is it possible to do engineering-wise? Absolutely. And the lack of water is one of the biggest drawbacks for growth in this country, for sustainable agriculture to feed the world and supply industry and for us to sprinkle our gardens when we want to in the summer. It could come at a massive cost. But while we're letting boat people jump the queue because they've got 10,000 in their pocket, why don't we just over the next 30 years say, if you've got 500,000 and you've not been convicted of any criminal offence of more than 12 months, you can buy Australian citizenship. But that 500,000 has to go into our drought-proofing fund. It's not inconceivable that over the next 30 years while we're preparing to defend against climate change, that anywhere between 300 billion and $500 billion could be banked through that process to drought-proof our country. How do we protect ourselves against storm surge? Well, the current government's already allocated $347 million to adaptation policy reports. Some of those reports have been done. They pay no heed, they seem to be hell-bent on a carbon tax. But a lot of three-dimensional mapping's been done of the Australian coastline, and the IPCC says that we're looking at the possibility of a 1.1 metre rise in the sea level by the year 2100. And the government's reports have taken into account that level of sea rise in conjunction with a 100-year storm surge to see which parts of our coastline would be inundated. It's been mapped. You can draw a red line on it. So how would we cope with that? Well, we could do something really simple like, by some year in the future, banning insurance companies for covering you for storm surge. Skeptics will still buy the property on the coast. Those who believe will buy it on the other side of the red line. It comes at no cost then, when the oceans inundate part of the land through that storm surge, to anybody. We could do similar things with fires and flooding, just by mapping and planning. You see, we've had much worse fires than the Black Saturday recent fires in Victoria and the Ash Wednesday fires. The worst fires were back in 1851, when nearly 1/3 of the state burned, and the Ballarat Times recorded the temperature at 117 degrees F, 47 degrees. The issue's not fires, they've always been happening. The issue is now that there are millions of people in Victoria, and then there weren't many at all. Only 3 were killed. It's the same with the Queensland floods. The Brisbane River flood was not a big flood relative to 1860, 1900 floods. And all those houses you see on poles around Brisbane, a lot of those are built on those poles because of flooding. And where there were no houses, that's because the floods were too big. Except we didn't learn the lessons of history and we built houses where it floods and, gee, you know what, it flooded. It is important to learn from the past, and it is really important to listen to what the climate scientists have to say. But it is absolutely ridiculous at this time, when the actions of all the other nations on the planet are taken out of energy sustainability and energy security issues. The decisions are not being based on climate change, and climate change is nearly irrelevant to most of them. Therefore, we cannot rely on emissions being reduced, and we should take simple, cost-effective legislative actions to protect our infrastructure and ourselves from climate change should it ever occur. If we do that, it will be money well spent, whether climate change occurs or not. If, on the other hand, the rest of the world is taking serious action, then we happen to live in a lucky country. Still, it is the greatest country on the planet. Renewable energy, we can get in heaps and bounds, leaps of it. The sun rises in the Pacific and sets in the Indian. We have so much solar energy available, it's unbelievable. It's the same with wind. It's cost-effective, expensive, and inefficient energy. But if we have to do it, we can. And until we have to, we shouldn't. And the problem with fossil fuels and sustainability is simply that they are running out for a lot of countries, or they're relying on gas pipelines from Russia running through a lot of countries with Stan at the end of their name and ending up in England, which is getting extra gas supplies from Russia as we speak. The issue is that our resources are owned by global companies, by large mining companies, and we have to pay the global price. There's one commodity that we have in Australia where we do not need to pay the global price, simply because it can't be exported. Brown coal is too volatile to export. We can have it for virtually nothing for hundreds of years. And while it's in our interest to mine it so that we can guard ourselves and defend ourselves against climate change, we should.